I wanted to firstly welcome our panelists, and I'll just run through who they are now for you. So Stella Upshaw, Chief Reframer at reframe.work Inc. So Stella is on a mission to humanize the workplace and works with conference boards, Fortune 500 corporations, and members on rethinking their workplace strategies. She also consults on how to create inclusive workplaces through the use of technology, human-centered design, people analytics, and future thinking. And I believe, Stella, you've also founded Amazing Community, which is a non-profit extending the work horizon for women 45 plus. Next to Simon. So Simon is a global HR professional that has worked in a number of industries over the last 20 years. Learnt your craft, Simon, in HR support to Aboriginal communities in Northern Territory in the 90s before you moved into mining, IT, and now the education industry. Currently at Navitas, which is a very big company in Australia in terms of the largest private education provider, and he oversees the HR function for 25 countries. No small job. Mm-hmm. And then finally, we have Alana Bennett. So Alana was most recently the head of employee experience at oOh!media. You have a deep passion for experience and the importance of getting this right at work. I think I can sort of attest to that with the work that I've done with you before, Lana, as well. So you believe in the fundamentals of who we are as humans combined with your focus on experience. And because of those two things, you started Connected Experience, which seeks to help organizations, leaders, and individuals understand how being and living connected lives make us individually more fulfilled and organizationally drives business performance. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining today. I'm looking forward to this conversation very much. I would like to start, if we look at where are we right now. So Stella, I'll probably ask you this one first. You're joining us from the US, so it's a little bit different to the Australian environment here. But COVID has brought about a rapid change in the way we operate at work, and whether that's our physical location, the way we communicate, or the way we sell our products and services. We are now a few months into that pandemic. What have your key observations been so far from what you've seen?
I think there is such a big 180 degrees turnaround from a lot of trends that we've been seeing over the past decade, really, because the economic boom and tight labor markets turned overnight into a decimated job market. The drive for digital adoption and digital revolution now became the digital reality. Everybody is adopting some sort of a technology as they have to move virtually, as they have to adapt their operating model. We were looking at the advent of automation and trying to bring some of those, intelligent automation, AI and analytics into the space of HR, and that became overnight predominant with more monitoring and frankly more data being available to do analysis on. The other interesting things that are happening obviously is the global supply chain, and on one side we've been on the globalization stream quite some time, and suddenly as the lockdown happens, as borders shut down, there is a lot of fragmentation in that supply chain, and organizations are starting to think how to localize some of their delivery and operations activities versus offshoring them to a low-cost location. A lot of the work from experience perspective is being impacted too because of the social distancing requirements for the need to focus on safety and well-being of the workforce. And I think companies have now moved away from a longer range planning towards more of a scenario planning, since we are in that hammer and dance model that I think was describing the best of how we can look at the foreseeable future, right? So you have to use the hammer to flatten the curve, and then it's a dance as the economy opens, and then we see a little bit of spike in infection, and then we close it in, and it's on and on until there is a cure or vaccine, frankly.
And if we cross over back to Australia, so thank you, Stella, for that. Simon, from your perspective, what are you seeing? What have you seen? Because I know that you've most recently led your company's HR function, sort of responding to the pandemic and establishing a platform to, once normality starts to return. But what have you witnessed so far in the work that you've done on that?
Well, look, as Stella was saying, we're seeing this huge drive to adopt digital, and you see Luddites being pulled into the now a lot quicker than they probably would have liked to have been, and people have been skeptical about working from home, distributed workforce are realising that it's actually not as scary as what they might have thought it once have been. You see also too businesses saying actually productivity is really good, and we've had a massive burning platform for change, and people have just got on board, and businesses are pivoting like you've never seen before as well to adopt. Also seeing a lot of change to operating costs as well. Businesses are saying that working from home is actually quite a cost-efficient way of doing business too. So there's a lot of motivator there at the moment for this way of working, and not sure how long it will last. There's other things too, like a massive reset in terms of travel and businesses that travel heaps as well. And do we need this travel? And I was talking to one of our regional sales guys the other day, saying he's never been more productive in his life. He's 40% of his time spent traveling. Now he's been able to structure his day, work through some major pieces of work. Again, pivoting with the way that products have been changed as well. But there's some real upside to this this unfortunate situation.
And Alana, you saying that similar upside, because I know that, again, like the average organization will go through 5 major changes a year, but that sort of is normally controlled by us. And as Simon and Stella have talked through, this is definitely not being controlled by us at the moment. So have you seen that's been still, there have been those positive effects from the people that you've worked with yourself?
Oh, look, absolutely, undoubtedly. I think all the points that Simon's, talked to around kind of productivity and innovation and I think people's ability to be able to control their time and how they use that time, there's huge benefits from that. I think what has been really interesting, and I don't think for any of us on this panel that we're surprised by this, but I think what it has actually absolutely amplified is we are human in nature. We're hardwired to connect. We're emotional beings, and I think this has really kind of amplified that. It's really propelled some interesting conversations with leaders around how do you work and understand the emotional state of the humans in your business to actually help them navigate this change? And we do that in a way that's kind of emotionally led, and a way in which makes them feel safe. I keep thinking of Maslow's hierarchy, and we are so in at the bottom of that pyramid right now, and I think we will be for a long time. So the conversations that leaders are having with their teams has definitely shifted. And I think that's great. I think we're having conversations around how do we purposefully connect. So I think in the early days of this kind of mad rush to get everyone at home, we literally went, how do we do work in the office, and we'll just transpire that to doing it at home. And then we saw this kind of overwhelm of Zoom meetings and people getting really fatigued and, I can't be on Zoom calls all day. So then, entering into this conversation around how do we purposefully connect? What's the right forum and conversation to have? Is it Zoom? Is it a phone call? Is it a chat? And I think these are conversations that we actually should be having regardless of the physical workspace. But I think certainly COVID has really amplified some of these conversations, which I think is fabulous.
And are there any parallels that we can draw here between what we're seeing happen right now? And if you look back to the 2008 financial crash that we had, is probably the most recent in history that we've gone through. Alana, if I sort of stay with you, what was the role of HR sort of through managing that crisis, and how do you think it differs to what we're going through right now?
This is a physical well-being, crisis. So I think it's so different. I think you're actually talking about people's physical well-being. So HR has really come into their own, I think, in this space. We are the custodians of looking after the workforce. So I think whilst there are parallels in some respect, it's a really different crisis. I think inherently within that then is when you talk about physical well-being, there is fear associated with that, and that sparks such a different response from employees and organisations around my own safety, kind of back to that Maslow's hierarchy piece. So I think whilst there are some parallels, I think the sheer nature of this being about our physical safety really puts it in a different lens.
And Stella, if I cross to you with that, because the impact was probably more profound in the US of that of that '08 crisis. Are there any nuances or any similarities or parallels that you're drawing at the moment from what you're seeing?
On the economic side, obviously we're experiencing like a big economic crisis. I think the labor market was not as impacted at that time. Now we've been seeing, over 40 million employees unemployed, and a lot of them are going to have their unemployment benefits expiring at the end of July. So it's going to be an interesting time to see how people can preserve their livelihood and ability to, survive and have access to some sort of an income protection. In addition to the health crisis, of course, that was not present in 2008, we are also seeing a big social movement for social justice, and that kind of compounding a lot of the exposures and risks for health to be impacted, since a lot of people are demonstrating and protesting, and we see riots and we see unrest in some parts of the country. So it's economic, it's health crisis, it's human crisis, it's social justice crisis. So we're seeing multiple compounding factors that are creating a very uncertain and very volatile situation. And I think for organization, a lot is about HR and humans, right? How we keep them safe, how we keep them, and how we bring more equity. How do we include people and create that sense of belonging? How do we create safety and stability in their jobs? And all of that is in the realm of HR. I think if the finance organizations were more prevalent and more involved in 2008 crisis, I think right now HR is really at the forefront of that transformation and has the opportunity to really lead this change.
Yeah, totally agree. And maybe if we stick on that now and talk about the experience a little bit more, Simon, where were things at before we kind of went into the pandemic in terms of the employee experience? So the key focus points of what you were particularly looking at for your organization, and how do you think that whole world of employee experience has actually changed now as we're going through a very different environment?
Well, I think, Stella and Alana both sort of touched on it. The HR role as custodian, or the voice of care for the staff, is really being brought to the fore now. The wellness, health and safety function is as critical now as it's ever been. And in white collar businesses, OH&S is often the poor cousin trying to try to be relevant, and now it's absolutely their time to shine. And I also feel, paradoxically, we're disconnected, but at the same time, we're opening up ourselves and our private lives to people that we work with, and we create a sort of a identity in the workplace, and now that identity is being disrupted by us seeing into everyone's private lives, and that can be a challenge, and there's risks associated with that. And for some people, this is an invasion, and so I think that's something that we need to really be aware of, and support people. And everyone is not comfortable just opening up a Zoom and being on a call in the privacy of their own home. And we need to be aware of that. So whilst we're disconnected, we're also opening ourselves up in ways that we've never had before as well. And I think there's some challenges that'll come with that. I like the analogy with the Maslow's hierarchy, and people are under threat from so many different angles, and probably more so in the US, as Stella described. But people are under threat, and their well-being is under threat. And one of the and I want to make sure I raise this, one of the pieces of the business that is really coming under a lot of scrutiny and a lot of pressure is our payrolls. So as every business is pivoting, they're looking to cost out, they're reducing FTE, they're reducing people to part-time work, they're making restructuring changes. the people who, at the end of the day, that have to figure out, well, how all these changes in ways people are paid, the rosters that they're working, the payouts at the end of the day. This is payroll, and if your payroll team are not getting that right, that's, we talk about Maslow and these hygiene factors. The one area that is the most critical for the employee experience is around getting pays right, but they're coming under so much pressure, so much scrutiny that it really does challenge everyone who was under all these other stresses at the same time as well. If I can't get my pay right, if I don't understand what my pay is, but so that one function, I just have so much empathy and sympathy for them at the moment, because it's also they're coming under a lot of pressure in every organisation that I speak to at the moment.
And I think that note on pressure and the stress that's being faced by a lot of people, we did a recent webinar with Are You OK? Where we really looked at the fact that this is a very, and I think we were talking about it before, a very human experience that we're going through right now, but really who we are as humans is governed very much by emotion. And perhaps if we sort of move on to that and explore that in a bit of detail, Alana, I'd love to get your take on this, but we are very much beautifully human. If you put it that way, we are very complex in terms of how we operate, but we do very much fundamentally still operate on an emotional basis. And that's a lot of the research that we do shows that, you're processing 200 times emotions 200 times faster than you are rational thoughts. So if we are doing this stuff, it's clear that in times like this, it's just going to be exacerbated. So for you, Alana, in terms of this employee experience, I know this is something you were passionate about anyway before we went into this. What role do you think emotion does play when it comes into the employee experience?
Yeah, look, I think this is such a fascinating space to explore in the context of the crisis, because I think that what has fundamentally changed from an employee experience perspective is that emotional need. For everything we've talked about around, kind of that Maslow's hierarchy piece is, emotion, the biggest emotional need driver for people right now is to feel safe and feel connected and, to have certainty. And that's really hard when there is so much uncertainty surrounding this virus. There's no one saying we're going to be back in the office and life will be back to normal by this date. And so for people to navigate the emotional, experience of that is really challenging. And so again, I think to a point I mentioned earlier, I think the conversation the leaders are now having therefore has really got to change and be really open and forthright around, what is it that you need right now? What is it that is worrying you right now? And as much as we can, and for those that are comfortable, to be really promoting that we're having those honest conversations, because, to Simon's point, the challenge is we are disconnected in terms of that physical connection piece. And so therefore, when you haven't got someone sitting across a desk from you, you can read their body language and, you're missing all of those really subtle cues are so important from an emotional perspective. I think the other layering that you've also got is that, to the point you just raised, Tim, is that, we feel the emotion before our brain has kind of kicked in and labelled it, right? But how I will label it and how you will label it and Simon and Stella, it may be 4 different emotions that we're all experiencing in that same situation. So that can be really tricky for leaders to navigate, in that kind of team setting of how do I get this right? Acknowledging that, there's a number of people in front of me who may be experiencing this slightly differently. So I think the more that we can help leaders, lead through this experience with, some really good questions and open communication, I think that the better we'll be in a position to kind of come out of it, somewhat, knowing what we're walking into. But I think it's a really tricky balance. And then, to Simon's point, you've got people who probably are really uncomfortable about being really open and honest. And the challenge is that, my fear is that they will suffer the most because we have got this barrier around how we truly connect with them at the moment.
And maybe if I can come back to then that point that Simon made, but I want to ask Stella to get your input on this. So because again, right now I'm in my bedroom. Yes, it's a very open, just like have a look at where I sleep all day. Well, not all day, all night, should I say? But when it comes to it and the role of personality and the fact that we try to understand who we are fundamentally as people and the role of empathy and everything else that Alana's talked about there. Stella, what do you see? I mean, does this change when it comes to, particularly in the US market, the role of when people want to understand who other people are that they work with, the role of emotion, the role of experience? How does that differ for you in the US as opposed to some of the things that you've heard right now from what we're seeing in Australia?
There are so many complexities and lenses to look at this challenge through. On one side, people do not travel, they can be a lot more productive and accomplish a lot more. They may have a lot more focus time or not, just because you have a lot of these digital tools, a lot of interruptions, and you may not necessarily be able to, well, you may need to allocate a lot more time to coordinate and just build these bridges and relationships and conversations and agreements, and all of that fills up your calendar. And if you overlay that with your caretaking responsibility and having to homeschool children, that's a whole nother level of issues that you have to deal with. So that all of this adds stress. What we've seen in some of the research in the US done on the productivity data, people obviously a lot more productive, right? They work longer hours. There's an increase in the number of meetings. There is an increase of number of emails that goes out outside the working hours. And naturally, people compensate by having to flex their schedule during the day to then spill it into their personal time and space. And the challenge this creates is that while originally when people started working from home, they said, finally, I don't have to commute. I have extra 3 hours that I can now go work out, create a healthier routine. And all of that went out of the window. People do fill it out with work, and they have that sense of guilt that they feel they need to work. What's interesting in the data we've seen is the engagement level, while at the beginning was spiking and going unusually high, over time it started declining. I think the reality is setting in, and people say, is this it? This is how it's going to be. And the fact that it's not sustainable really to maintain that peak productivity all the time and all the time connected. And we also see an increase mental health issues, a spike in people's feeling anxious and stressed and having to deal with caring for sick family members. All of this is compounding the anxiety and the fear of losing the job. And so from emotional perspective, I think it's a huge, huge problem. The other thing that we don't appreciate as much yet, it is that we had built relationships with people we work with. We have a history, we figured out how to work with each other, we know what to expect, how to read certain signals virtually now. So we have an awareness. However, people who are newly entering the workplace are going to have a really tough time integrating into the culture and learning the new norms. And I think those who have not had any experience, especially young graduates, will have it the toughest because they don't necessarily know what it's like to work in an organization, how to observe the norms and adopt them into their practices. So I think this crisis is impacting different segments in an unexpected way that we've seen before. And the notion of diversity and inclusion now is expanding, right? You need to pay attention to who have been infected versus who have not been infected. That's a whole new privileged class, those who can afford to work from home versus those who cannot. So those who are digitally fluent are becoming now the new class of digitally affluent group. So it's a very different set of dynamics that creates a different complexity to manage from HR perspective, but also for us as humans to adapt to it.
Yeah, I think it's particularly interesting to witness I've seen quite a few people that have started new roles in this time, and it must be such a bizarre way to start a role from everything that they've been used to before. Interestingly, we did have a comment through Q&A here, and I think this sort of talks to what you were saying, Simon, that payroll and accounts are the ones that struggle with Zoom and communication methods because the traditional hidden comfort zone produces these sorts of people. So it's the idea that sort of needs to change and make it easy. And it's so true, because if you look at the different personalities that you find, like generally in the work that we do, so those people will be more guarded, more disciplined, that sort, and they are generally more introverted in that. So if you're suddenly asking introverted people to effectively then open their whole world up to everywhere else, some of them actually enjoy it because it makes them feel like they're in more control. But then for some people, it's like, wow, this is such a big change for who I am. But I think another interesting point that sort of came out from what we were just talking about there was that before this, so remote work was one of these big key benefits that many organizations offered. And I referenced before how people have just sort of started in this sort of role now, but they haven't been used to that before. I think people were starting to realize how beneficial that sort of thing was in terms of how you could work from home remotely. And this was great flexibility that people would be offered as employees. But what happens now? So, I mean, how do you now attract and retain that talent? Because I think we're also going to go through a big cultural shift and you know, as big changes have been made across organizations where you need to make sure you're retaining the best talent you have to get you through this and then to get you beyond it as well. So what do benefits start to look like? Alana, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that specifically.
Yeah, look, I think this is really interesting, and it's going to be fascinating to see how employers respond. I was reading in a research article yesterday around looking at even actually how candidates' behaviours are starting to shift in terms of what's being important components that they're looking for as they're applying for jobs. And we've moved from this idea of having a look at what some of the benefits and the career opportunities and all that sort of stuff to actually, again, we talk about this Maslow's hierarchy, right? What are the real kind of core basic components of the job? What am I doing? How does communication, happen within the business now that the business is remote? The real mechanics of how will I do my job is actually what's starting to, the questions that candidates are starting to ask. So it's interesting, even as we think about, not even benefits, but how we're attracting people to our organisations, is we need to change that dialogue. We need to change the information we're serving up, because what's actually important for them is how they will connect to the team, how they will do their job. What is the digital, technology that will help them do their job in the context of the environment that we're in. And I think, from a benefits perspective, it's fascinating, because when I've worked with organisations, is they start talking, and we start talking about experience. They start talking about the free yoga and the foosball table and the breakfast, and I'm kind of like, whoa, that's not experience. And so I don't think it'll be wildly different, to be really honest. I think for those organisations that are really committed to a true experience agenda, which is kind of how we do our business, not what we do, I still think that the benefit will be along the lines of how do we allow our people to truly connect to each other, to collaborate and get work done, to be innovative and creative. I think those principles will still apply. I just think how they show up will look slightly different because of the nature of how we're working.
And Simon, what's your take on that? With you leading, all of the work you're doing for Navitas around this specific response. So what's your view on what this will look like as we move forwards?
So the big thing that we're focused on at the moment is, being in the best position possible to be able to come back on that other side of the V. And, to do that, what we're saying with our workforce is we want people to be connected, stay connected to the work. And these are people also that were being stood down or being reduced, and they're working from home. So how do we stay connected to this group of this talent that we have, and not just sort of lose them over the course of this time? How do they also stay healthy? And that's physically healthy, mentally healthy, and financially healthy. We've included as well. Obviously, that has an impact on your mental health, but financial health, we want people to try and maintain as well through this period. So we're looking at ways and advice and support around all of that. Look, they're the main things for us, but also how do we have people skilled in and support people to be skilled in this new way of working as well. So it's, as fundamental as how do you operate a Zoom call? How do you set yourself up in your home office technology? But also our work is pivoting. We're moving away from sort of traditional product offerings into more digital, more online. There's a lot of people that this is a massive threat and challenge to their own abilities. How do we support them being able to come along on that journey as well? So then when we do come out on this V, people feel like they're part of a team. They're able to be agile enough to operate as part of that team because they're being connected. They're actually focused because they're physically well, they're mentally well. They don't have financial stresses there, so they're not looking for other jobs. They're ready to come back with us, and they've got the skills now to support them in this new world. So that's the sort of that's the three big tenets that we're looking at to support people through this period. And hopefully, as a business, we're able to take advantage of our good position compared to our competitors, and we're able to bounce back quicker, and we're going to be a healthy organisation in the future. And that's what we're looking at doing, Tim.
And if we turn a little bit to just the broader makeup of companies as well, because I think another issue that's been coming out, obviously recently, very much in the US, which is then cascaded everywhere else, is the whole notion about diversity and inclusion. And I think still, I'd be really keen to get your thoughts on this. Has the pandemic changed the view that we take towards those things? Obviously, we've seen some really big, what we hope is then some really big positive changes actually going to come out of this that, is so overdue that's not funny. But do you think that it has changed, particularly with the way organizations view this?
I think this type of change is going to take time to play out, because it's been going on for decades and decades, and it's difficult to undo it all overnight. There are societal norms that need to change. There are organizational norms and practices that have to change. The encouraging thing we see is the stand a lot of leaders take, and I think it's so important to have the right tone and make the right statements. Yes, at the beginning, it may be just a statement that it's issued to support this change and encourage employees to reach out and help each other and pay attention and include and check in. But more importantly, that already puts the onus on them over time to create goals and hold leaders accountable for these changes and tie their compensation and rewards to attainment of this goal. And obviously that is not going to happen over time. It's going to take a little bit, but again, HR will be in the middle of this. And it's important to bring the conversation about analytics as well, because even if you disclose some of the data about your workforce composition, that in itself may create a change for the better. Because if you say, this is my diversity at the moment, that puts pressure externally as well as internally on the leaders to say, we need to improve this. If we see a pay disparity, we need to make a change for that. So transparency and disclosing some of the information, it's the first step in the right direction.
And I might come back to you on this one, Lana, as well, because I think the other interesting part about diversity and inclusion, if I draw some sort of parallels from what we're looking at broader in society at the moment, there was so much talk about climate change before we went into this, and everybody was like, well, this is so important, we need to be doing it. And the fear is, I think a lot of people have, is that this sort of stuff just distracts them from, because everybody goes inwards, it's just about me, it's the tribalism stuff we talked about before. So what's your take, particularly from an Australian standpoint, and I'll probably cross to you, Simon, afterwards, what's your take on where we sit on these things, and will we lose the focus on it for now, or do you think that this is maybe tied into sort of like what an organization wants to be and stand for?
I think it's both, yeah. And I think what makes it really challenging at the moment is economically, it makes it hard to make change and have action. So I think to Stella's point, I think a lot of organisations are looking at what is our position on this? How do we have the right statement and have unity across their organisation around that? But that's really challenging then, it starts to create, movement around, well, this has to be better. But if part of that is actually around, hiring so that you have got a more diverse workforce, or, equalising some of those pay disparities, that's really hard in this economic environment. So I think it's really challenging for organisations to kind of, be showing action. And so I think, therefore, it's a real balance around what is your statement. You can't not say something, right? Because this is too big. You've got to have a position. But we have to be really strategic in terms of, and I think part of this is how brave and vulnerable organisations are prepared to be to actually have this open conversation with their employees. I mean, we through this pandemic, we have seen beautiful examples, and we've seen the Airbnb, communication around the changes to their workforce. I mean, that made my heart smile for days, that they were so brave to really engage their workforce as part of that. So I think this is not dissimilar in terms of how we have that conversation, and start to think about how we reduce the kind of feelings of the barrier to having that conversation, that it has to be a small intimate group, but actually just being really open and honest. I don't know that there's an easy way to navigate through this right now, just given the economic environment that we're in. But I think having some really open conversations with, you know, your workforce is a really great position to start.
And Simon, your view on that one?
Look, I totally agree that you've got to have a position on it, and you want to be on the right side of the ledger, obviously. And then the big challenge is finding the space and time to take action. Then the conversation itself and taking that position in a very open way, externally and internally, you know, is a really important thing to do, and that actually does then support people in their decision making in the workforce anyway. So whilst you might not be having some sort of structured approach to this, by actually being very explicit about where you stand as a company, that then gives people the license to operate in a certain way as well, and also gives them a big signal: don't act in other ways. You know, and you know, going back to my earlier point, you know, with the way that we are working all over Zoom and opening up our private lives, there's people are being, you know, their personal identity and their work identity is being merged a lot more. So this, unfortunately, then gives people opportunities to make decisions about how they work with one another based on things that aren't necessarily relevant in the workplace. So there's the opportunity to discriminate probably greater. So we just need to be aware of that. And the opportunity to exclude people and not work with people is greater as well. It's easier to not invite someone to a Zoom call, but if you're, you know, all working on the same floor, and you know, it's harder to exclude someone. So the opportunity is there as well. So that's a very sad thing, but it needs to be called out. And I think positioning as a company is so important to support those sort of things from, you know, not flourishing and not coming to the fore. So I think, you know, it's a really good start, coming out with a position and giving everyone a good guide. But I do agree that there's so much challenge and activity going on at the moment in every organisation, that finding the priority to be able to put this up a bit higher is, you know, something that people really need to think about hard about.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. If we move on to technology now, so I think you were sort of talking about Zoom there, and I think we've talked about it a couple of times through this conversation as well. But the reality is, technology has taken a far bigger role. And I think, as you were sort of saying at the beginning there, Simon, you know, for those people who didn't want to get involved, they haven't had much choice to actually get involved with using more of the technology. If we think about the world before then we got to where we are today, what role did technology play in HR, and what do you think has changed now? And like, I'm really interested to try and drill more into the appetite that, you know, these people that are being forced to do it, they're being forced to do it, but how have they then actually reacted to it? They've been forced to do it, and now actually what's happening from that. So Stella, maybe I could start with you on that, with the US market. What are you saying there?
As Alana was saying earlier, right, a lot of people have moved to work remotely, and they just transitioned the same poor processes and experience to just doing it remotely. And I think now that cumbersome experience is catching on, I think a lot of people are realizing that there is a better way to do it. You don't need, first of all, the infrastructure is being pushed to test to limits. Some companies had to shut down the videos just because their bandwidth was not supporting the number of calls that they had to make, or video calls to make. Their systems may not be integrated, and it creates errors, it creates, you know, dropped cases. Challenges was actual productivity. The other interesting thing is, which is a really negative trend that I've seen, is that a lot more companies are starting to deploy surveillance tools just because they feel they have the need to monitor whether the employees are working and are staying productive. And of course, that creates distrust, that creates disengagement. So it backfires in a way to set some of those things up. On the flip side, I think what I'm concerned about with what we're seeing right now is increased adoption of automation. Companies say, oh, we actually can do a lot more remotely, therefore let's automate a lot more work and some of that orchestration. And that may have a negative impact on the stability of jobs, right? A lot of people may lose jobs just because, you know, robots and chatbots are not getting sick, they're not, getting infected, and adoption of technology will probably accelerate a lot more. So the question that it's in my mind is what is the responsibility of HR to intervene into that conversation and say, well, monitoring and surveillance, it's not a good idea, and there are invasion of privacy, and we shouldn't pursue productivity just for the sake of productivity. Automation is great, but it should be done for the purposes of helping humans do a better job, and enabling them to be more productive and have control over their workload, as opposed to just doing it to cut costs. The other interesting area that we will see probably a big disruption is the whole physical space, and whether companies will preserve their physical footprint in the way we knew it, at the same size, or would that be considered part of the cost to be cut. On the technology side, I think there is a significant opportunity to adopt touchless interfaces and devices that enable people to stay safe regardless of how, what the proximity or the layout of the office space can be. So all of that thinking that has transformed the customer experience and how we as consumers engage with different brands, I think it's time to bring that type of thinking and designing the experience of workers too. How can you look at the journey of the worker from the moment they wake up in the morning until they close the laptop or whatever their device is at the end of the day, and what it's like to be a worker, and how can you use technology to make that experience better?
And this, I couldn't think of a more perfect transition to go to you, Alana, because I know that this is something you focus a lot on, have focused a lot on, in terms of the intersection of technology with that experience.
Yeah.
What's your take on what Stella was sort of saying in the other question?
Yeah, so look, I think what this is going to do is actually going to really force, HR functions to have a digital employee experience strategy. And I don't think there's any way not having that in that environment. I personally am a massive fan of how we bring, technology to life from an experience perspective. So I think it should have always existed, but I think this will just accelerate, that real need around being really clear around what is my digital employee experience strategy and what is my employee experience strategy, because they are different. And I think importantly, organisations now need to recognise that they are really different. I also think, there's a massive opportunity for us to harness the technology in a way in which we bring, community of lifelong learners together. I mean, if we think about, how we connect with our workforce now is, and what role does learning and development plays, there's such a massive, massive opportunity. And there are some really amazing platforms that are doing some great work from an experience perspective. But I think we've got to come back to being really, really strategic around what is our digital employee experience strategy, and how does that intersect with our employee experience strategy. And to Stella's point, I think it's, looking at what is that journey that employees are having from the minute they get out of bed until the minute that they start their work to they end their work. We've always said, we have such amazing consumer experiences that I think now that's even more pronounced, because we have got, humans that are doing more of their consume and their buying online because of the environment that we're in. And so it's hard to not sit there and be saying, I go online, I buy this product, and I get it done like that. I can almost touch it. It's so real. And yet I just want to go and find my pay slip, or I just want to, do something for work, and I don't even know where to go, who to ask. It's really, really hard. So I think those parallels, I think employees themselves are going to start to be demanding more from that experience perspective, because they're feeling the consumer stuff even more pronounced. We're not going to the shops as much as what we used to. So yeah, look, I suppose, my piece of advice for a lot of, organisations that I'm doing work with at the moment is to really implore them to think about, a best in breed ecosystem. I think we've so far moved from this day and this strategy of kind of having one platform that does everything. We know that doesn't exist. We have to look at what is the best in breed for this experience and that experience, but then really importantly, how are they talking to each other? How are we using the data that all those different platforms give us to inform what we do next? And start looking at what are some of those metrics that we focus on, rather than HR has largely always been focused on these lag metrics. We need to really be moving away from that.
It's so fascinating, Simon. I don't know what you're, because I was watching you react to some of that. Do you have your own thoughts on this about that best in breed ecosystem? What does your HR tech stack look like?
Well, not not going into that too much, but look, I really resonated what Alana was saying about customer experience and focus on customer experience, and it depends, I guess, on products and services that you think about buying a white goods or something like that. There was at a 15 years ago, there was some inherent value people and would see about going into the shop and being able to look around and get advice and have that experience of the bricks and mortar shop. But then there's a recognition then of pricing and where that ends up being in terms of the value that you actually get from that experience versus I buy it online, it's $100 cheaper, or I've got a greater diversity now of being able to select fridges or whatever it might be. We've actually gone through that experience ourselves at the moment too, and looking at the way that our services are offered to our customers, and what we're finding is our pricing strategy has to be absolutely on ball, because there's inherent value of having people physically located, through education. There's a huge amount of value that's aligned to that. Similarly, there's also a lot of value that employees put on engaging socially as well. So, we're talking about all the upside of working from home and all this sort of great stuff, but we are taking away this thing that people do value hugely, which is that social side. You look at, the traditional, one of the great engagement questions that, is, do you have a best friend at work? How can you have a best friend at work when it's going to be online? That's not the experience of making a friend and having a friendship, that I know. It's about going to coffee or having a beer after work or whatever it might be. And that's sort of taken away from us. So how do we actually now use technology to try and help people have that level, depth of relationship with people at work, which really is where people engage? This is going to be a massive challenge for us, and, I think I also see, we've spoken before about, the absolute huge leap that we've taken in engaging with technology, and a big bit of it's about efficacy as well. How do you actually use this in an effective way? And for quite a while there's been technology there that people have been able to just engage with on a superficial level, but now you've really got to engage with it on collaboration tools. You think about people sort of go, oh yeah, I'll go and post on Yammer today, but now actually Yammer's becoming, or collaboration tools like that are becoming so integral to engaging with one another and having that social experience, when before it was an afterthought for a lot of people. You can only have to do it as a superficial way. But there's now these things, the value in a lot of this technology is actually people are recognizing and waking up to it, and actually can use it in a more masterful way than they'd ever been able to use before, because they've been forced into this situation. So I think, there's great opportunity there for people, but it's not necessarily going to replace the full experience, but people will start to understand the value in the alternatives, I think, over time.
Perhaps we stay with that trend as well, that thought topic there, and I might go to you, Stella, but I think continue on from what Simon was saying, there will be changes, but do you think engagement and performance will fundamentally look different as a result of this pandemic? We're going to measure the same things. Obviously, the connection part that someone's talked about there, and one of our strongest drivers of human behavior, very, very important. But do you think that the way we manage our people, everything will actually fundamentally look different as we come out of this? Or will it just be one of those processes where it sort of changes a little bit and then kind of goes back to what it was?
I don't, and of course, nobody has the answer. And
I like to ask those questions just to, yeah.
It's like, ooh, this is being recorded. I don't think we're going to go back. I think there is so much goodness that came out of this. People realize that they do more focused work. They do have more autonomy when they work remotely. The leaders are getting comfortable with the idea that they don't need to see people in order to know that they're doing work. and as more people move digitally, there is better and more effective ways to measure that performance and productivity. I do think the measurements will probably change, and the types of segments we're going to look at is going to change, right? So we probably will introduce a new vocabulary. We will talk about essentials versus not essentials, right? We will need to look at the company's curve where they are, right? Are they a company that needs to survive? And as a result, they need to make different decisions, as opposed to a company that is on a growth and their services are in high demand. So the measurements and productivity and the expectations will be different. In terms of the skills, I think when you look at the workforce in general, traditionally would do plan the headcount, as opposed to now we need to think differently about work planning and the skills you need, as opposed to how many people in seats you're going to have, because you may now have the option to tap into alternative sources of talent, be that people that are freelancers, or they may have be located elsewhere where traditionally you wouldn't hire, but now with remote work, you have access to those skills. Nevertheless, I think people with higher, with experience and discipline and ability to work remotely and comfortable with this agile ways of working are going to continue to be in high demand. And the more organizations can adopt some of these tools, I think the better will not only be for the organization, but also for the employees who are learning how to use these tools. What it was interesting to see in some of the council meetings that I've been part of is companies that have been trying to adopt certain technologies for years have adopted them over a couple of weeks. And I think there's an acknowledgement that you can go rogue. There are certain things that have to be perfect, 100%, like payroll, but a lot of things don't necessarily have to be 100% perfect. You can go and iterate and adapt as you discover bugs or you realize things don't work out. And that design thinking principle where you prototype and you continue to adopt, I think it's finally coming to the world of HR too, with the collaboration and technology.
Yeah, so interesting. And I think I'm just conscious of time because that hour has gone very, very quickly, which obviously is always a good sign of a good conversation. If we can maybe just lead out on that point, but maybe just sort of saying as well that coming back to the whole purpose of this webinar about the role of HR, HR can be sometimes seen as a more transactional function, but I think as we've talked about, and as we all know, might be biased of course, but we know the role that it can have to actually really transform an organization. If I could just get one piece of advice maybe from each of you, and I'll start with you, Simon, but how could you recommend to other HR leaders to use this as an opportunity to more partner with the business and to sort of demonstrate that critical function? Is there any advice that you would give to some of your peers?
Look, we're in such a uncertain future. I think utilizing your experience and knowledge about how putting in place certain actions are going to impact the business, and try and anticipate then how that is going to support the business in this new environment. Like in the past, we've had, we could do objective setting for a year because we know what the environment's going to be looking like, or we have a pretty good idea about what that environment's going to be, and then therefore a company can set themselves up to have a certain goal in years' time. We're going to do this, and you align your business. Now we don't know what that environment's going to look like in a year. Everyone's guessing as to what that looks like. I think being agile enough to move through that time, working with your business and support them and the staff, and be that voice of care as well. I think, we talked, Alana said about custodians before. I think HR really is the voice of care, and it's supporting, not only is it a virtuous thing to do, but it's also the right thing to do, and it also supports companies and their brand and their ability to be able to engage with staff and bounce back in the future. So I think that's a really important role for HR as well.
Love it. Yeah, Alana, your thoughts?
Yeah, so look, I think I've got probably two things I'd love to share really quickly, and I think one of those is we can't be creating the HR strategy in isolation of the business strategy, particularly right now. I think, you know, HR needs to be working with the business leaders and be looking at what are the people problems that we need to solve as a result of this business strategy. So I think that's first and foremost. I think second to that is that we need to really be challenging ourselves to think about our employees as our customers. So again, the same conversation we're having with our business about our customers, we need to put in that exact same lens over our employees. And I do think that that is what will genuinely really bring that experience agenda to the forefront for organisations.
Thank you. And Stella, ending with you.
I have three. One, shifting your thinking from building an HR strategy towards people strategy. There is a difference there because you're not thinking how HR is going to execute necessarily, but how HR is going to support the workforce with accomplishing the business goals or whatever the intent of the organization is. The second one is think about experience as opposed to HR as a process, as a silo, right? We think about talent acquisition, performance management, talent management, etc., as opposed to thinking about the journey employees go through as part of their worker experience. And then the last one is collaboration. I think the HR has an opportunity to bring together space planning, technology, infrastructure, all the services, and create that employee experience in a cohesive way. And up until now, I don't think there was a role to play that, and HR perfectly fits into that space.
Very well said. Well, thank you so much, everyone. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I think there's so much to take away for the audience as well. So this will be obviously available on record to those people that couldn't make the webinar today. I will probably just end by, I will share my screen quickly just to put up a link if anybody would like to chat with our panelists. So you can sort of see them here if I can work out how to make my screen share. So just again, a big thanks to each of you, so Simon, Alana and Stella, but you can see each of them here if you'd like to learn a little bit more about what they do, either Navitas Connect Experience or reframe.work. And also on us, if anybody was wondering about who we are and why we're hosting this, again, this is a little bit about what we do, and you can get in touch at helix.com to learn about how we can connect your people as well together. But once again, panel, I'd like to say thank you so much. Very much appreciate it. Thank you for giving your time up, and we will, we'll chat to you again soon.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Pleasure. You too.